All right, gang, so now we're getting into chapter 2. You've just had your first class without me here physically, so we're getting into our digital learning phase of this semester. We've talked about scales and keys, and we've talked about identifying notes and key signatures in the circle of fifths. Now we're going to start talking about intervals. Intervals are the spaces between the notes. We'll have 2 videos to get through chapter 2. This first video will show you how to calculate what intervals are, and then we're going to talk about moving intervals around and doing a little bit more math with them and figuring out how intervals apply to the key signatures that we've already learned about. So here we go. An interval is defined as the space between notes. We have 2 different ways of describing intervals: melodic, where one occurs after the other, or harmonic, when they occur at the same time. Whether melodic or harmonic, intervals are always measured and described with the same kind of terminology. Let's get into that. Here we have a chart that's taken from page 27 and 28 of your textbook, or the Chapter 2 interval size section of the ebook on the website. This chart outlines the basic intervals, that is, counting from letter name to letter name or lines and spaces on the staff, regardless of accidentals. If 2 notes occur on the same line or space, regardless of accidentals, we call them unisons. If notes are on adjacent lines and spaces, that is, the space or line directly above the previous note, we call that a second. If a note is 2 away, that is, on one line, skip a space the next line, or on a space, skip a line the next space, we call that a third. One more line or space away is a fourth, and then a fifth, sixth, seventh, and finally we have the octave. We define the basic intervals by counting the number of letter names that have been spanned. A unison could start on C and ends on C. One letter has been spanned, so that's 1, or unison. A second spans 2 letters, a C and a D, that's 2. A third is 3 letters, a C, then to a D, then an E. When counting your intervals, always be sure that you count starting from your original note as number 1. Intervals don't all occur within the space of an octave. Sometimes they're larger. We call intervals larger than an octave a compound interval. That is, the smaller or less than an octave interval name adding to the octave. This chart comes from page 28 and 29 of your textbook, or also from the ebook. In here we see on the left side the standard basic interval size, and on the right column we see the compound equivalent. A second is 2 letter names, C to D. A ninth would be that D an octave higher, so that would span 9 letters total going through the musical alphabet. It's kind of odd math, but a second plus an eighth, or octave, equals a ninth. The second example is a third. A third spans 3 notes, C, D, and E. If we take that E up an octave, we span a total of 10 letter names, or 10 notes. So a tenth is a third plus an octave. The rest of this chart shows you the other common compound intervals going from the second through the 7th. Unisons don't have a compound interval. A unison up the octave is simply just an octave. An octave up the octave would simply just be 2 octaves. Now that we've covered the basic intervals, it's time to start factoring in the accidentals and what happens when you add sharps and flats to the intervals that you see. When describing intervals, we say that we're referring to the quality of the interval, and the interval qualities can vary depending on what kind of intervals they are. Seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths can be described as major and minor. Unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves are described as perfect. They can be something other than major, minor, or perfect. If it's smaller than minor or smaller than perfect, we say it's diminished. If it's larger than major or larger than perfect, we say it's augmented. Let's dig in and see what that actually means. Let's start with a very easy example. Here we see on the staff a C and a D. On the keyboard, the C is here and the D is here. To get from C to D, we go up 1/2 step to C sharp and we go a 2.5 step to D. So therefore from C to D is 2 1/2 steps away, or 2 semitones. We call 2 semitones a major second, or it's written with a capital M and the Arabic number 2. If instead we went from C to D flat, that moves the D flat to this spot on the keyboard, which is only a 1/2 step away, 1 semitone. We call 1 semitone a minor second, and it's written with a lowercase m and the number 2. You'll notice that throughout the videos, the major keys, major intervals are always written with a capital M. Minor is always written with a lowercase m. Here we have our next interval, C to E flat. We can see by the spacing on the staff that it's some kind of a third. Here we see the C and the E flat also marked on the keyboard. Counting 1/2 steps, C to C sharp is 1, C sharp to D is 2, and D to D sharp, or E flat, is 3. C to E flat is 3 semitones. We call that a minor third, written lowercase m and the number 3. The next example we can see is another third, but now rather than E flat, we've moved up to E natural. That added 1 more 1/2 step, so we have 4 1/2 steps, or 4 semitones. We call that a major third, which is written, you guessed it, capital M and the number 3. At this point, now you understand the basic concept of counting your 1/2 steps or semitones using either a piano keyboard or counting through letters and their accidentals on the staff. Rather than showing you every individual note, here's a handy chart that outlines the basic semitones and their intervals, both common intervals and a little bit less common but possible intervals. This can also be found through your book on pages 29 and 30. As you look down through the chart, note the way the intervals are abbreviated. We've already talked about lowercase m meaning minor, uppercase M meaning major. The uppercase P stands for perfect. A lowercase d, like minor, means diminished, which is a smaller interval, and the uppercase A, larger than major, is augmented. At this point, pause the video so that you can process this chart, and if you need to, write it in your notes so that you're able to reference it down the road. This wraps up the first part of what you need to know for intervals. Quite a bit of information has been presented here. Be sure that you're reading your book and using the digital resources on the textbook website to help you out, and if you need to, go back and review the video once again. There is some content in the textbook that we haven't covered on here yet, so be sure that you're reviewing that as well. Look soon for the second half of Chapter 2 video coming out very soon, and also be sure that you're working on the digital assignments on Blackboard. Thanks so much, and looking forward to seeing you guys in a couple weeks.